I hope this concept of an Arctic sentry developed through a NATO framework is something that can reassure the American president that we will together take care of security and surveillance in the Arctic region.
Now, the Danish Prime Minister is visiting Nuuk for talks with Greenland's leader, discussing plans on to how to deal with Donald Trump's ambitions to take over the island. The US president posted on social media that following a meeting with NATO boss Mark Rutte at Davos, that and I quote here, framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland had been reached. Well, let's welcome Christian Friis Bach, who's the chair of the Foreign Policy Committee in the Danish Parliament, with us. Christian, good afternoon. Thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you.
What does framework of a future deal over Greenland mean to you? What do you think Donald Trump means there?
Well, I think it's important to say that this is not a deal. It is not a framework agreement. It's a framework for a future deal, because no decisions on Greenland can be taken without Greenlanders and Danes in the room. Davos is a political festival. This was a talk conducted in the margins of this festival, and now the task is to get it into a negotiation room, the room that was created in Washington when the Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers met with the vice president and the foreign secretary of the US. This is the negotiation room, and now this negotiation room is where talks should continue.
Do we know anything about this framework, what it entails?
We don't know a lot, but I can say what I imagine is the best way forward. And also, given that this was a talk between the NATO Secretary General and the President of the United States, and it followed a talk between the Foreign Affairs Minister from Greenland and our Danish Defense Minister and Rutte just a few days before. And what is on the table, in my hopeful imagination, is to create a NATO Arctic sentry. Like when you had increased threats in the Baltic Sea, we created a Baltic sentry. And now I think this is, I hope, what is on the table to create an Arctic sentry that can increase our surveillance and the security in the Arctic region, and not least in Greenland, by means of a NATO, as I said, sentry and Arctic mission, where we can add ships and planes and drones and satellites and all of it together under a NATO umbrella in order to, again, protect the Arctic area, increase our surveillance and security in the Arctic region and in Greenland.
Christian, I know I'm asking you to do the impossible to get into Donald Trump's brain, but do you think that will placate the US president's desire to own a part of Greenland? This has been at the center of his argument. He said that, look, it's of great security importance to the United States, and you won't defend something if it's on a lease, if you don't own it, if it's not yours. How can a NATO sentry placate his desires to own something in Greenland?
Well, I'm not in the mind of the president.
I appreciate that.
I don't think any of us have been there and can predict exactly how this will go about in the future. But we've heard the president of the United States saying again and again that we need Greenland, international security, Arctic security, European security even. And the way we have ensured security not only in the US, but in Europe and in Greenland, which is a NATO member, is by our NATO alliance. And I hope this concept of an Arctic sentry developed through a NATO framework is something that can reassure the American president that we will together take care of security and surveillance in the Arctic region.
Well, Christian, he seemed to have reacted in a completely different way when several countries sent troops to Greenland, including one member of military staff from the UK. But he took that as an affront. He took that as Europe saying, get your hands off Greenland, we're ready to defend it. I mean, again, And I know you can't get into the mind of the president, but is that what he's been after? Do you think at the center of all this rhetoric of, am I going to use force to take Greenland? I know he stepped away from the threat of tariffs, but at the center of that, is it just been about security, or has it been about adding to the size of the United States?
I have taken note of the fact that the president, indeed, he did threaten with tariffs when he saw the countries that joined, the European NATO allies that joined in increasing the military presence in Greenland. He did react with tariffs, but he also stated subsequently that perhaps he had been misinformed. And I hope this is exactly what happened in the meeting in Davos, that he received more thorough, comprehensive information from the NATO Secretary General about not only what had happened in Greenland with European NATO allies doing a training and planning mission in Greenland, but also what could happen with NATO creating this Arctic sentry in Greenland and the Arctic area. And I hope this kind of more thorough information is what left an impression on the president. And at least we can take note of the very positive fact that the military threat has disappeared and the tariff threat has also been removed. And this means that now it's up to the diplomatic efforts in the high-level working group that was created in Washington. The high-level working group shall now sit quietly, peacefully, diplomatically, and negotiate the framework for this agreement that can be shaped in order to increase the security in the Arctic region.
Christian, some people have speculated whether or not part of this framework of a future deal could be something similar to what we've seen the UK deal with Cyprus, where there's two rather substantial bases on the island of Cyprus, which are sovereign land. They're sovereign bases to the United Kingdom. Could something like that, for example, be put in front of the president? Would something like that be acceptable to Denmark or Greenland to give sovereignty to several bases for the United States on Greenland?
The Secretary General of NATO have said clearly that territorial claims were not on the table during the talks in Davos. The sovereignty of Greenland is a red line. It's only for the Greenlanders to decide on this. We have a 1951 agreement with the United States that allows them to open, well, almost all the bases they would wish to in Greenland. Once they had 17, now they have one. Once they had 15,000 people, now they have 500. And if the Americans ask, they will most likely, I can say almost totally, with total certainty, Denmark will reply, yes, you can come and establish further bases like the Pitufik Air Base, where the Americans have clear rules. They have total autonomy in deciding the framework of the base and the operations in the Pitufik Air Base. Of course, there's an agreement upon which we have to have mutual consent, but Denmark have for long pushed for increased presence of the US and of NATO in the Arctic region and in Greenland. So here you have an open door. Just ask, and I'm sure this will be taken down very positively, not only by the Greenlandic government, but also by the Danish government.
What we know from some polling that has been carried out in Greenland is that there is quite a lot of opposition, in fact, a lot of opposition to America owning Greenland, if you like. But what we've also seen is a lot of support for Greenlanders wishing to be independent of Denmark and the United States. What's Denmark's view on Greenlandic independence?
Well, this is the beauty of the kingdom that we have. And in a time where countries all over the world, they fight for territory, not least in Ukraine, of course. We see increased tensions around Taiwan and in other parts of the world. The beauty of the kingdom is that we are three countries that are together on a voluntary basis. And if Greenland would want to be independent, Denmark will support Greenland all the way. That and there's already in our current agreement covering them being semi-autonomous, there's already a paragraph that can be invoked if Greenland wants to proceed towards further independence. But I think within this pressure we have seen and what has happened during the American threats, I think I can say safely that was what it was. I think Greenland have understood that for a small, strategically important country to be independent can leave you extremely vulnerable. And this is, of course, why the Premier of Greenland have said repeatedly now that they choose the Kingdom of Denmark, or for now, they choose the Kingdom of Denmark, they choose the European Union, they choose NATO.
Okay.
This has been repeatedly said because I think this has been an eye-opener also for the Greenlandic people. You cannot be independent and without alliances in a world full of instability and in a strategically important position.
Okay. Christian, just one final question. Do you trust Donald Trump to stick to his word? He said in Davos, teased it in his speech that he's not going to use force to take Greenland, and he stood down from his threats for tariffs for the nations that opposed his ownership of Greenland. Do you trust him to stick to this?
Well, we've seen the positions changing quite rapidly over the past couple of weeks. I think we have now a mutual understanding that we have to discuss this at a negotiation table and not in a SOMI account. And I think this is very important. And we trust that this process that has been agreed will now continue, and diplomatic and quiet and confidential negotiations will be conducted between Denmark, Greenland, and the US, three close allies that have stood together ever since the Second World War. Denmark have been one of the Americans' closest allies, and we have fought with them in the front line, not in the back, in the front line. In Afghanistan, we were there in Iraq. So I trust, yes, now we have reached a different level of mutual engagement and discussions, and it will be peacefully and reliable and diplomatic what will happen from now.
Christian, thank you so much for giving us your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Christian Friis Bach, the chair of the Foreign Policy Committee in the Danish Parliament.